Let's turn the mic on. This hearing will come to order. The hearing titled Proposed Small Arms Transfers, Big Implications for U.S. Foreign Policy will focus on the implications of the Trump administration's proposal to transfer approval for small arms sales from the State Department to the Commerce Department. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I'll now make an opening statement and turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. And hopefully Mr. Zeldin will make it to us. We've got 2 panels today. If Mr. Zeldin doesn't make it in time after I finish the opening statement, we'll turn it over to Ms. Torres, Congresswoman Torres, for her statement. So, let's frame this hearing and why I think this is an important topic. When we're thinking about this, this isn't a hearing about gun control. There's already a decision that we will be selling and exporting small arms, regardless of what my personal opinion might be or the opinion of others. That's not what this hearing is about. In addition, this hearing isn't meant to be a criticism of the Trump administration. That's not what we're talking about here as well, since the Obama administration actually contemplated a similar rule change and then made the decision not to go through with it. What this hearing really is about is something that I think we can all agree on, Democrats and Republicans. When we choose to export these weapons, we want to make sure that they're going to legitimate allies, that they're being used for legitimate purposes, and that they're being used by our friends. We also want to make sure we have a thorough vetting process to make sure the weapons are not being used to commit human rights atrocities. We need to ensure that we have mechanisms in place to ensure they end up where they were meant to be shipped. And since this is the Oversight Committee, we also want to make sure Congress has appropriate oversight and the abilities, and there's a congressional notification process. Now, we've been exporting more and more arms to Latin American countries, particularly those in the Northern Triangle. And if I can have the first slide. If you look at this slide, again, you'll see it's not just under the Trump administration. You'll see the exports both to Mexico, where we've seen a rise in violence, but also to the Northern Triangle countries, and that's been going up over the last few years. And the reason why I'm choosing to focus in a little bit on the Northern Triangle countries is when we think about the crisis we're having on our southern border right now, it is in part because of the rise of violence in these 3 countries. If you look, there were 110,000 asylum seekers in 2015 from the Northern Triangle. That was a 5-fold increase from 2012. In 2016, 42% of those apprehended at the southern border came from the Northern Triangle. These countries rank in the top 10 for homicide. Doctors Without Borders, doing a survey of Northern Triangle citizens in Mexico, said 40% had relatives who'd been killed in the last 2 years. 31% knew someone who had been kidnapped. Again, look at that graph and look at the exports of small arms to those countries. That's the reason I believe we should be having a process to make sure we're not inadvertently creating the chaos in the Northern Triangle. We are not inadvertently creating that unrest. Because when I think about addressing the crisis at the southern border, these are individuals that are human beings. They're just choosing to try to find a better life for themselves. They're fleeing that violence. And if we don't address it in the countries there and try to create some stability and find solutions in the Northern Triangle, we will have to do it at our borders. Now, the state can do a better job ensuring arms don't fall into the wrong hands, but removing oversight mechanisms will increase the probability these weapons are being misused to create further violence. Again, I'll acknowledge that all of us want to prevent U.S. manufactured weapons from ending up being used against civilian populations and human rights abuses. In fact, in the Philippines, security forces have committed thousands of extrajudicial killings. According to the Stimson Center, the U.S. has sold some $2 billion in arms to the Philippines, and it's likely American-made pistols have been used in many of these killings. What we're talking about today is what department has the best mechanism to control this. And both Commerce and State have different approval processes for arms exports. You know, the U.S. munitions list administered by the State Department under the Arms Control Act provides more control over arms exports than the Commerce Control List. It requires sales advance our foreign policy objectives and the national interest. Sales must be for friendly countries solely for the use of internal security, legitimate self-defense, or to participate in UN efforts to restore international peace and security. Additionally, it requires annual registration of manufacturers, exporters, and brokers of defense articles or services. It ensures no security assistance is provided to countries with a pattern of internationally recognized human rights abuses. Under the administration's plan, many small arms would be transferred to the new 500 series of the Commerce Control List from the U.S. munitions list. Although the Department of Commerce would still conduct interagency review before approving a small arms export license, there will still be significant shortcomings as compared to the State Department review. Philosophically, Commerce and State differ. State has to have the big picture foreign policy considerations and human rights considerations in mind. Commerce aims to boost our exports. In addition, no annual registration of manufacturers, exporters, and brokers of defense articles or services would be required if this rule change were to go through. There would not be a specific criterion for human rights abuses. Items on the U.S. munitions list currently require congressional notification for small arms sales over $1 million. This goes away with the transfer of these items to Commerce. And again, that's not to say State Department's perfect. A state OIG report requested by the office responsible for export control licensing found that the office hadn't followed proper internal controls and that licensing personnel weren't properly trained. And this, in some ways, was attributed to a 28% reduction in staffing. So as we kind of go through this hearing, you know, I think it's important for us to, again, it's not a hearing on gun control. It's not a hearing on whether we will be exporting small arms or not exporting small arms, but it is a hearing on the proper way to make sure these arms are ending up where they're supposed to end up, that we're selling these to friends, allies, and that they're not being used to commit human rights atrocities. And with that, you know, I want to acknowledge our colleague, Congresswoman Norma Torres. I also want to acknowledge the witnesses on the second panel. And with that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member. The ranking member is now recognized for 5 minutes to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses who will be testifying today. The decision to transfer certain defense articles and services from state to commerce began in the prior administration. This was part of a larger interagency process to modernize the United States munitions list to ensure the State Department retained oversight over only the most critical military and defense articles with military end use. This rule was supposed to be rolled out in December 2012. This rule change had strong bipartisan support but got caught up in a domestic gun control debate that had nothing to do with export control reform. The process to remove certain defense articles has already begun. In fact, here are just some of the categories of weapons that have already moved to commerce licensing controls: launch vehicles and missiles, explosives, military aircraft, submersible vessels, tanks, and the list goes on. Once again, these defense articles have already moved to commerce control. The jurisdictional transfer of certain defense articles in categories 1, 2, and 3 to commerce will reduce the regulatory burden on state to create a simpler and more robust system of compliance. And the U.S. government is not removing export controls for firearms or ammunition. Commerce still requires that U.S. companies obtain a license to export or re-export to any country any weapon currently on the Commerce Control List, a function it already performs. Any licenses that include these transferred items would still be reviewed by the State Department. Additionally, the government, that is both state and commerce, will continue its long-standing end-use monitoring efforts, including vetting of potential end users, to help prevent human rights abuses. This rule change should be finalized. After years of input from both sides of the aisle to make the change from state to commerce, there's no reason this decision needs to be delayed any longer. I ask unanimous consent that the following letter from the National Sports Shooting Foundation be submitted for the record. And if I may yield 1 minute to Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member. I hope that we have a robust conversation this morning about our export control system and the ways we can make it more effective and efficient. In 2009, the Obama administration launched the Export Control Initiative with the goal to strengthen our national security and increase the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing and technology sectors. The administration rightfully determined that our then export control system was overly complicated, contained too many redundancies, and an overly protective posture diminished our ability to focus our efforts on the most critical national security priorities. I'm disappointed that this common sense, good government, and bipartisan, or should I say once bipartisan issue has been politicized, and our domestic industries will continue to be unduly over-regulated until the government takes action. The proposal we are about to discuss is the epitome of this politicization. This bill does not provide ideas of how we can better regulate the export of defense articles or lift the burdensome regulations and registrations fees our domestic industry is suffering under. Instead, it proposes to completely stop this conversation and halt the actions that the current and former administrations embarked upon to create a better export system. We must work together and propose ideas that will create a more effective export control regime. I look forward to this discussion and hope that we can once again come to a bipartisan agreement on export controls that protect our national security, our constitutional rights, while promoting American industries, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry, and I yield back to the chair.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Sultan. I'm pleased to announce and welcome our witnesses to today's hearing. We were first joined by my friend and fellow Californian, the Honorable Norma Torres. She'll give 5 minutes of remarks and then depart because I know you've got another hearing to get to. Following that, we will be joined by our second panel. Jeff Abramson serves as a senior fellow for arms control and conventional arms transfers for the Arms Control Association. Dr. Susan Waltz is a professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy and the University of Michigan. And finally, Ms. Joanna Reeves is an attorney and executive director of the Firearms and Ammunition Import-Export Roundtable Fair Trade Group. I ask that the witnesses limit their testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared statements will be made part of the record. Thank you so much for being here today. I now ask Ms. Torres to summarize her remarks.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today. It is good to be back in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Across the world, firearms are used to kill people in a range of settings. The armed conflict in Syria, turf battles between drug cartels in Mexico, the repression of public protests in Venezuela, and terrorist attacks in a mosque in New Zealand. Whatever our views on firearms policy, we should all be able to agree that putting more firearms in the wrong hands would make the world a more dangerous place. Some of the most urgent challenges facing this committee: addressing the root causes of migration from Central America, defeating ISIS, ending the surge of human trafficking, and are more difficult because dangerous people have firearms. Failure to address these challenges will not only pose risks to the safety of U.S. service members and citizens abroad, but will also impact our homeland in the form of increased migration, terrorism, and crime. That is why I am so concerned about this administration's plan to change our firearms export licensing system. Under the status quo, if a U.S. company wants to export firearms, the company needs to apply for a license from the State Department, which will weigh the risks of that sale before granting a license. If the sale is over $1 million, the appropriate congressional committees, including this committee, receive a notification and can review the sale before it moves forward. The system is not perfect, I get that. For example, the State Department should have more resources to track where firearms are used and to carry out due diligence on recipients before the sales are approved. Sadly, the administration is taking the opposite approach, proposing to move licensing authority from the State Department to the Commerce Department. This is a bad idea for several reasons. I will describe just a few of them here. First, the Commerce Department has different priorities, a different mission than the State Department. If Commerce is making the final decision on firearm exports, I worry that they will do what is best for firearm manufacturers, even if it puts our national security at risk. When it comes to keeping firearms out of the hands of terrorists and drug cartels, we should err on the side of caution. That means keeping the State Department in charge. Second, the Commerce Department is not required to notify Congress before a sale proceeds. That means this committee would lose the ability to object to sales that raise national security or human rights concerns. It also means that Congress would be in the dark about where guns are going. This would be very dangerous as it would undermine Congress' ability to conduct effective oversight. Third, taking on this new responsibility would require significant additional staff time and expertise at the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security. But this administration has not provided Congress with a plan for increasing the Bureau's capacity. For these and other reasons, many experts and members of Congress have expressed their deep concerns about this change. I am glad that Senator Menendez has placed a hold on the rule to permanently block the administration's dangerous proposal from moving forward, and I urge this committee to consider a markup of my legislation to Prevent Crime and Terrorism Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Torres. We will now briefly reset so that the second panel can be seated. Thank you, and we'll now reconvene. I'll first go to Mr. Abramson.
Good morning, Chair Barra and Ranking Member Zeldin and other members of the committee. It is a privilege to testify before this committee today and discuss concerns about how the United States exports some of the weapons most used in violence around the world and propose changes that I fear could lead to greater human suffering. My comments here are an abbreviated version of my longer written testimony. In brief, the weapons and ammunition that are currently controlled under U.S. munition list categories 1 to 3 belong there and should stay there. There are many concerns about the administration's proposal to move semi-automatic and select other weapons from State Department regulatory control of military weapons to the Commerce Department's control of so-called dual-use items. Rather than transfer responsibility to an arm of the executive branch whose mission is to promote sales and for Congress to abdicate oversight, the best way to move forward is to strengthen the State Department's capacity and for Congress to better use its authority. We commend Representative Norma Torres and co-sponsor Elliot Engel for introducing H.R. 1134, which a number of members of this subcommittee have also now co-sponsored, and Senator Menendez for introducing S. 459, which keep the control lists from changing. These legislative efforts have the backing of a wide range of civil society organizations, including Amnesty International USA, Brady, Giffords, Global Exchange, the Violence Policy Center, and the Arms Control Association, where I am a senior fellow. The proposed regulatory changes are problematic for several reasons, many of which have already surfaced so far. First, the type of weapons pictured here, this administration wants to remove from State Department review and congressional notification actually merit the tightest export control. Research indicates that AR and AK type rifles and their ammunition are weapons of choice of drug trafficking organizations in Mexico and other Central American countries. Many can also be easily converted to fully automatic weapons. Many sniper rifles that would be moved to Commerce control are currently in U.S. military use. And as in the Sig Sauer advertisement from this year's catalog, many of these weapons are marketed domestically as, quote, featuring the same innovation and versatility as the U.S. Army's, available in a civilian version, unquote. Second, the fact that these weapons may be widely available in the United States does not mean they should be widely exported. In many of the countries where these weapons are likely to be marketed, they are considered military weapons and are tightly controlled. The fact is that anyone can build their own army with guns you can buy retail in the United States. While the rationale for the shifting to commerce was that the State Department should focus on weapons that provide the United States with a critical military or intelligence advantage, or that are inherently for military end use, drawing that distinction in this case does not match the realities of the world. Third, by shifting licensing authority to the Commerce Department, these weapons will be removed from the statutory regime devised for them by Congress. This has significant implications because there are a number of counterterrorism, humanitarian, and human rights provisions of the Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act that are tied to the State Department's control list. To begin with, Congress will not be notified of the sale of these weapons. In recent years, congressional involvement has helped forestall firearms transfers to repressive forces in Turkey and the Philippines, but it is difficult to imagine how Congress could do that moving forward if never provided the information that such sales were under consideration. My longer testimony details how the current regime provides requirements for suspension of future sales, reporting of misuse to Congress, and other critical capabilities for identifying and enabling prosecution of bad actors that will be threatened or lost under a commerce-controlled system. Unfortunately, we know abuses of U.S.-supplied weapons will occur, as in Guatemala last year when that government used U.S.-donated military vehicles to surround the U.S. Embassy, as seen here, and as was Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who reportedly transferred U.S. weapons to al-Qaeda-linked militias in Yemen. Under State Department authority, Congress will simply have greater awareness and ability to act on such abuse. Fourth, the commerce-led approach is different than that of the State Department and creates new risks, including capturing less information in licensing requests, a different end-use monitoring approach, lack of enforcement personnel in the Western Hemisphere, exemptions, and broad implications for the proliferation of untraceable ghost guns and 3D printed guns, for which the Commerce Department is expected to abandon control efforts. Many of these differences are detailed in a recent Government Accountability Office report. Looking ahead, the United States is far and away the world's largest arms exporter, and as such, can and should uphold the highest standards. That begins with Congress continuing to receive arms sales notifications so that they are informed and are able to act. Congress can also play a role in improving transparency in the State Department-led direct commercial sales process through which the majority of small arms sales occur. Congress can block or amend a sale up until weapons are delivered, and it is important for Congress to scrupulously monitor the entire process. Congress should also mandate much greater transparency on the specifics of what is in U.S. weapons deliveries. Finally, this committee, with its oversight over the State Department, should consider looking into the hollowing out of this critical part of the executive branch. As already mentioned, an alarming Office of the Inspector General report last month found that the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls did not implement sufficient internal controls. While proponents of the rule changes argue that Commerce is better staffed, the State Department has the most appropriate expertise to consider the human rights, security, and political implications of arms transfers. If further investment is needed to improve states' capabilities, that is the correct path to explore. Wrapping up, we must be mindful that we are not talking about benign trade commodities, but rather the types of killing machines that are arguably the ones most responsible for death and injury worldwide. In the words of Maria Herrera of Mexico, 4 of whose sons were forcibly disappeared by heavily armed men, quote, "They have their gun factories and they send them here as if they were pears or apples. They should think about the damage and destruction these weapons bring," unquote. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I have long been associated with Amnesty International, and my remarks are informed by its published human rights research. In an internal review that was undertaken about 10 years ago, Amnesty International found that some 60% of the grave human rights abuses it had investigated involved firearms. If that inventory were to be updated today, it would include, for example, the recent cold-blooded execution of civilians by uniformed Cameroon soldiers, an event that prompted the U.S. to withdraw millions of dollars of military aid earlier this year. It would also include Philippines, where since 2016, the government has encouraged targeted political killings that have claimed more than 4,000 lives in operations specifically conducted by the police. My concerns about the proposal under consideration were only heightened last month when the State Department released its audit report about a 2017 of 400,000 semi-automatic rifles to Philippines, a sale that never should have been licensed and for which the license was ultimately revoked. In my remarks today, I want to make three key points. First, the proposed regulatory changes seek to draw a bright line between fully automatic weapons on one hand and semi or non-automatic weapons on the others. And in human rights situations where it really matters, this is a distinction without a difference. It's a false dichotomy. In practical reality, there may be little difference between the semi and fully automatic types of firearms. A semi-automatic firearm can fire about 45 rounds a minute, and non-automatic sniper rifles can shoot with great accuracy over long distances. These are powerful, lethal weapons. The soldiers in Cameroon last summer used semi-automatic rifles. In Mexico, the local police in Guerrero State that were responsible for the enforced disappearance of 43 students in 2014 were armed again with semi-automatic rifles. The point here is that in many perilous human rights situations, the weapons that are slated for transfer to the Commerce Control List are every bit as threatening as fully automatic weapons. The bright line, as I've said, proposed by the administration makes a distinction without true difference. And secondly, there's more to the proposed regulatory changes than first meets the eye. What is ultimately at stake here, and this is, I think, a crucial point for the committee, is which rules, which laws will apply to the exports of these small but lethal weapons. Over the years, Congress has embedded important human rights provisions in two key statutes, the Arms Export Control Act and the Foreign Assistance Act. And the provision of these laws, generally speaking, apply only to defense articles, as defined by their presence on the U.S. munitions list. So if you remove these weapons from that particular list, then ipso facto, you exempt them from the related statutory constraints, and therein lies the rub. These various statutory controls are tied together in an elaborate legislative architecture that in the past 15 years, American officials have touted as the gold standard of arms export laws and regulations. The cradle-to-grave control system that we have promoted internationally includes multiple statutory requirements, including, among others, a multi-step registration and licensing procedure for exporters that provides several opportunities to detect irregular aspects of an application. It requires, as has been noted, congressional notification of firearm sales that exceed $1 million. It includes tough controls on brokering and the possibility of both pre- and post-shipment review through the State Department's Blue Lantern program. So together, these provisions constitute a robust oversight mechanism, and without mitigating action from Congress now, the straightforward and seemingly innocuous act of transferring items from one regulatory regime to another would essentially nullify the export laws as they apply to non-automatic and semi-automatic weapons in one fell swoop. My final point relates to a specific concern about the regulation of firearms brokering and human rights implications. I don't have time to go into details now, But let me just say that brokering activities, which by statute are defined as financing, transport, and freight forwarding, are understood by human rights advocates to be the weakest link in the chain of regulatory controls. And it is of note that in the case of the 2017 Philippine sale, it was an issue with the middlemen in Florida that alerted U.S. Embassy personnel to the likelihood that something was awry with that transaction. In closing, I want to say that I'm not opposed in principle to export control reform, but it strikes me that these particular regulatory changes are irresponsible. As far as I have been able to ascertain, these are the only complete lethal weapons that are being transferred to the Commerce Control List. In December 2000, the U.S. pledged to the world that we would observe the highest standards of restraint in our small arms export policies, and these proposed changes betray that pledge. The best course of action, in my view, would be to retain the current range of firearms on the U.S. munitions list by supporting H.R. 1143. And failing that, I would urge you to amend the statutes to ensure that the weapons transferred to the Commerce Control List would be included in the statutory definitions of defense articles and security assistance. Thank you very much for your attention and the opportunity to share these concerns.
Thank you, Professor Waltz and Ms. Reeves.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Barra, Ranking Member Zeldin, and other distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for inviting the Fair Trade Group to testify today on this important issue of reform to our export control regulations and the perceived impact such reform may have on our national security and foreign policy. The Firearms and Ammunition Import-Export Roundtable, or Fair Trade Group, is made up of firearms and ammunition manufacturers, importers, and exporters who serve both civilian and government customers. We work closely with U.S. federal agencies to improve regulations governing the import and export of firearms, ammunition, and other similar articles. The proposed rules that are at the heart of today's hearing are to transition commercially available firearms from the export controls of the U.S. Department of State International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, to the controls of the U.S. Department of Commerce known as the Export Administration Regulations, or EAR. Since the publication of the proposed transition rules, there has been a plethora of misinformation and mischaracterizations. First, the proposed transition rules are not a decontrol of manufacture, transfer, or export of firearms or ammunition. The proposed changes are part of an effort to reform outdated regulations and right-size our export control system, an effort that started under President Obama in 2010. The proposed shift in oversight responsibility is long overdue and will help strengthen the national security of the United States by ensuring that export licensing authorities can focus on those items that warrant control under the ITAR rather than waste resources on export licensing for springs and bolts or for items that are available in sporting goods stores and retail outlets. Not all firearms and ammunition are slated to transition to the Commerce controls. The firearms that will remain under the Department of State are those that are inherently military, including fully automatic firearms, modern large caliber munitions such as mortars and howitzers, high-capacity magazines and drums, and all specially designed parts and components for those articles. For the firearms and ammunition that will transition over to the Department of Commerce, this is not a decontrol or a deregulation of those articles. Under the EAR, exports and license applications for firearms and ammunition will be subject to controls under national security, regional stability, crime control and detection, the Firearms Convention, United Nations sanctions, and anti-terrorism. Indeed, the proposed rules make it abundantly clear that the Commerce Department will require a license to export or re-export firearms or ammunition to any country, including Canada. The proposed changes are to licensing processing, not policy. End-use monitoring will continue under the Commerce Department, including vetting of potential end users. In addition, the State Department, as well as the Department of Defense, will remain very involved in the review of export license applications for national security and foreign policy reasons pursuant to the Export Control Reform Act. Further, the Commerce Department will not approve any license application if the export will violate the laws of the destination country. Another myth is that the Department of Commerce does not have the capability to control firearms or ammunition exports. This is not true. The Office of Export Enforcement is the only federal law enforcement agency exclusively dedicated to the enforcement of export control laws, specifically the EAR, and does so to protect the national security, foreign policy, and economic interests of the United States. OEE works closely with the Department of Justice to prosecute criminal violations and with the Office of Chief Counsel for Industry and Security for civil enforcement cases. This reform to our export control system is long overdue. Because of the age and wide-scale availability of the underlying technology, many firearms and ammunition do not have the characteristics that provide critical military advantage to the United States, nor are they exclusively available from the United States. Unfortunately, the current policies and regulations have prevented the U.S. firearms and ammunition industries from becoming reliable suppliers to our allies and, in general, competing effectively in the global marketplace. We therefore urge Congress to permit the right sizing of the outdated one-size-fits-all export policy for firearms and ammunition so that these industries may be regulated like the other defense sectors that have experienced export control reform. This reform will not result in the decontrol of firearms and ammunition, and it is critical to the positioning of our manufacturers in the world market and thus our national security. Chairman Bera, Ranking Member Zeldin, and other distinguished members of this subcommittee, this concludes my testimony. On behalf of the Fair Trade Group, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Reeves, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. You know, Mr. Abramson, in your opening remarks, you touched on something about 3D printing rules and so forth, and I think this is an important component that we ought to touch on. And within State Department, when 3D printing and how to make a gun that was undetectable was going to be posted on the internet, the State Department put a stop to it. Now, there was a lawsuit that was filed with that, and State Department settled it. But right now, that lawsuit is being contested by about 20 state attorney generals. And what we're told is if this rule change goes through, Commerce won't enforce the ruling not to post this on the internet. We don't know how this lawsuit's going to get settled, but I do think, from an oversight perspective, I've got some concern, and I think this body ought to have some concern as to whether we think it's a good idea for people to post how to make a 3D printed gun that might not be detectable. That puts our kids at risk. That puts all of us at risk. All of you had to go through security screening when you came into this building. Well, again, from my end, I don't think it's a great idea for someone to figure out how to make a 3D printed gun. That hopefully is something that we can work on in terms of trying to figure out how do we make sure that technology doesn't end up in the wrong hands. I just thought it was important for us to point that out, and that I actually think State Department did the right thing. I'm not thrilled that they settled this, and I'm glad the state attorney generals have stepped up to try to prevent that posting. Again, this hearing is not about gun control from my perspective. That's not the intent. It's also not about putting our manufacturers at a disadvantage to the rest of the world. I've long been an advocate for looking at our export control regime and making it a little bit more streamlined. In some of my dealings with other countries in India, and in particular, there are items that don't make sense to be on the export control list that, if they're not purchasing from us, they'll be purchasing from others. My concern in this hearing and what might happen with this rule change is I want to make sure we're not treating everyone the same, that as we're interacting with countries that are allies that share similar values, et cetera, That's one thing. But the reason why I focus on the Northern Triangle countries is in areas where we know there's an increase in violence, we know there's an increase in homicide, our values as Americans and as leaders in the world and wanting to occupy the higher moral ground, we shouldn't want to think that our guns are contributing to that or our small arms are contributing to that destabilization. Particularly, as the president has pointed out, some of the crisis on the southern border. If we don't try to address it in the countries that are contributing to some of this migration, we'll be addressing that on the southern border. And I think, again, as the world leader, we have a responsibility to try to address this. So, maybe I'll turn to either Mr. Abramson or Professor Waltz on this one. It does seem to me that there is a lack of, once these arms are sold, to be able to trace whether U.S. arms are being used in some of these atrocities. Maybe Professor Waltz, you touched on, what happened in Cameroon and other places, and I think that's something that we ought to figure out, and, whether that's State Department doing this, whether that's Commerce, whether it's an interagency process, but if atrocities are happening, are these U.S.-made arms that are being used in those atrocities?
I'd say, turn this on. I would say that is the most difficult issue with regards to these weapons. They're small, and they come from many different places. And to try to do a ballistic analysis to figure out what weapon was used in what particular instance is really, really challenging. And then to try to figure out whether the weapon was transferred in a lawful way or in an unlawful way, it makes it a really tricky issue to tackle, period, which is the reason why doing all of the due diligence up front to make sure that you've done as much as you possibly can to prevent the arms from going in the direction where they're going to end up in unintended hands is so important. We do have some examples of U.S. weapons being used, of weapons that were known to be transited from or supplied via U.S. channels that have ended up in hands, but very often these are not ones that were sold commercially. They were sold, perhaps transferred by U.S. military. But that is in many ways besides the point. The part that I think that all of us are really concerned about is the prevention. What is the best system for keeping the weapons from getting out and into the wrong hands in the first place? And doing the system that is now in place has a review at registration, a secondary review at licensing, the possibility of going into a place and looking at the weapons. The last item that I would say here is that while Commerce Department does have the uniformed and armed officers, they don't actually have anyone on the ground in place overseas in the the Triangle area of Central America. So they're really without the possibility of pursuing this at this point.
Right. Well, I'd love to work with the ranking member on, again, if we're selling small arms to Canada, it's one thing. If we're selling small arms to Honduras, it might be another thing. And what I understand is, it's better to be sure and do our due diligence on the front end to make sure where those weapons are going, and then at least on the back end having some ability to make sure they ended up in the right place. So I'd love to work with you, Mr. Zeldin, on what that might look like. And with that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Reeves, is there anything that you would like to weigh in on the conversation I was just having? Taking place?
I think regarding the registration point, I think it is important to notice that under the Gun Control Act, manufacturers of firearms and ammunitions must obtain a federal firearms license from ATF. And the form to do that is, it's an application for a federal firearms license, and on that form, manufacturers or would-be licensees must disclose all responsible persons who are at the company. And a responsible person is not a nomination. It's actually a role of the job function. So if you have the power to make decisions at the company pertaining to firearms or ammunition, you must be designated. The background check that goes into that licensing process is pretty extensive, and on the form itself, it includes country of birth, it includes citizenship, and it includes addresses for the last 5 years. So in terms of registration, it's not a completely black hole because that will be covered domestically under the Gun Control Act for licensing.
And how does the Commerce's license review process differ from states?
Actually, not that much different, because what will happen on the back end is when a license application is submitted, Commerce Department will take that license application and put it through an interagency review process. This is actually going to be required under the Export Control Reform Act. Part of those agencies include Department of Defense and the Department of State. The Department of State will refer everything to the Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau, DRL. So they will be intricately involved in reviewing license applications on the front end, and they will do so under foreign policy and national security.
Do either of the two witnesses want to weigh in on that?
Yes, briefly. It's not a question in my mind of the Commerce Department suddenly wants weapons to end up in the wrong hands. I don't think that's the concern. Obviously, I have concerns about Commerce's approach is more towards sales, but the reality is the way the system is set up, the State Department captures more information during the licensing process, and ICE officials and others have told us that information is very helpful as a deterrent value, but also later for prosecutions. The State Department will have a role in the commerce if Commerce is taking control, but the State Department won't have that primary authority of making that decision. Commerce will still hold that, so the State Department's role will be lesser. But there's other pieces of this where the Congress will not be notified of misuse. That will happen if it is something that's controlled through the State Department. But when we go through the Commerce Department, you have different requirements about how the law is applied. So your oversight capacity will change. That's some of the big changes that we're talking about.
If I might add, the changes and the processes that we're talking about right now, once these items move off of the U.S. munitions list and are no longer defined as defense articles, it's no longer mandated by law. It's all a matter of regulatory practice and procedures within and I think that's a crucial point, because what is required in the early years, in the 1970s, when some of this was set up, for 6 or 7 years, the administrations did not follow the general guidance of Congress. It wasn't until it was locked into law that these became really enforceable provisions. And what we're really talking about is possibly exiting them from the legal requirements.
So I appreciate all three witnesses for that exchange, but just to sum up some of the items that have already transitioned from USML to the CCL. Category 4 launch vehicles, guided missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, torpedoes, bombs, and mines. Category 6 surface vessels of war and special naval equipment. 7 ground vehicles. 9 military training equipment. 10 personal protective equipment. Category 14 toxicological agents. Category 15 spacecraft and related articles. Category 16 nuclear weapons related articles. So it's just really important to note just how much of a transition has already been completed between USML and CCL. So this isn't. I appreciate the hearing and the conversation today, but Commerce has already established quite a robust and proven role in many other pieces of equipment that people would also suggest are consequential for this related debate that is the context of this hearing, and I yield back.
Yeah, if I could just comment on the ranking member's observation, that last observation. I think, Professor Waltz, you talked about the difficulty of tracing and tracking small arms, which is why much of the due diligence, I suspect, has to be done on the front end, whereas if we're selling an aircraft carrier to a country, we can probably better track how that aircraft carrier is being utilized and used. So, but I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm glad that we've made some of those. Mr. Malinowski for purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Reeves, you mentioned the State Department's DRL Bureau. I ran the State Department's DRL Bureau, so I can speak a little bit to these questions. And when we were having this debate at the State Department in the last administration, there were arguments on both sides, but let me first attest, the arguments had nothing to do with our domestic gun control debate. They had to do with a broad understanding that violence against civilians around the world, mass violence by militias, by criminal terrorist organizations, by rapacious abuse of governments, is not committed by aircraft carriers. It's not committed by boats, largely not by planes or by tanks or by howitzers or by mortars. It's committed by small arms. The reality of places like Congo, Central America, Burma, is that small arms are the weapons of mass destruction of our time, and that's why we were very, very sensitive about getting this right. One case I was involved with involved the Philippines, where we discovered an impending commercial sale of small arms, not to the Philippine government or Philippine police, but because we in the State Department had a thing called an embassy in the Philippines and large numbers of people who monitored such things, we realized that the Philippine police was purchasing arms from the dealers to whom these small arms were going to be sold. This was at a time when the Duterte regime, well, it is still doing so, was conducting a campaign of extrajudicial executions as part of its so-called drug wars, including a lot of innocent kids who were being rounded up, killed in the middle of the night by gangs that were actually police officers off duty. And so we made the decision at the State Department to freeze that sale. I can 100% guarantee to you that if the Commerce Department had the final say in that sale, they would not have made the same decision, because the Commerce Department's ethos, mandate, and mission was to support American manufacturers in their efforts to export their products. That's perfectly fine. That is exactly why the Commerce Department exists. The State Department exists to raise foreign policy, human rights, and national security considerations. So let me ask a few questions. Maybe Mr. Abrams and Mr. Waltz, you can take the first few. Does the Commerce Department have personnel at U.S. embassies around the world that monitor these sorts of issues? Yes or no?
No.
Does it have any staff assigned to review firearm sales to Central America, the Philippines, Afghanistan, Congo, Cameroon, Sudan, any of the countries where these issues might be of concern?
It has a few, 3 or 4 people stationed in various parts of the world, but none for Latin America, and I don't believe any for Africa as well.
Right. And does it perform these due diligence checks, particularly on human rights, before a sale goes through?
It has not so far.
So let me ask you, Ms. Reeves. You spoke in your testimony about outdated regulations. Is the requirement that Congress be notified of sales over $1 million an outdated regulation?
No, I would not call that an outdated regulations for items governed by the U.S. munitions list.
For small arms, for semi-automatic weapons? So if we were to sell 20,000 AR-15s to the Philippines, would it be an outdated regulation for Congress to be notified of that?
Well, one thing that I will point out is that the $1 million threshold only applies to small arms, and it's significantly different from the next highest threshold, which is 14 million. This, of course, affects significantly U.S. manufacturers from being able to ship to our allied governments, because when they have contracts that exceed that amount of money, it's significantly delayed.
So would you, if the rules change goes through, would you support legislation that would impose the same $1 million threshold reporting requirement, even though it's going through the State Department for small arms?
I would have to see what the legislation is.
Would you support legislation that would require the Commerce Department to do a review of the potential human rights implications of a sale before the sale takes place?
I think the legislation is already there. I think under the Export Control Reform Act, there is a review process that is specified under the statute, and in the review process, DRL, State Department objections to a license would not be overruled.
Okay, well, I'll close by saying, in my experience, for any item or issue where the Commerce Department had the final say under current rules, and I can say, for example, surveillance technology is a very good example of this, where there's a vote by a committee in which Commerce, DOD, and the State Department each have one vote. In literally every single case, in my experience, where the State Department did not have the final say, and the Commerce Department had either a vote or the deciding vote, the Commerce Department 100% of the time voted for the export of, say, surveillance equipment to dictatorships that were going to use them against dissidents, journalists, et cetera. Unless there is a change in the ethos, mission, and mandate of the Commerce Department, I have no reason to believe that that will change. And I would hope that the industry, in its own interest, would support maintaining a very robust review process, because if you don't have that, you are going to find yourselves caught up in front page stories about U.S. weapons manufactured by your members being used for things that will outrage the American people, and people will wonder who's responsible. You need the State Department to protect you from that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I'll recognize Mr. Perry for purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Reeves, are you familiar with the IRGC? Do you know who that is?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the fact that that the IRGC or components of those folks are driving around in Iraq in American-made M1 tanks?
Am I aware of that?
Yeah. Just asking.
Yes. I mean,
Yeah, right? And we are outraged by it, but the point, and do you suspect that a tank, an M1 tank, is significantly more lethal than, let's say, an AK-47 or an AR-15?
that would be my assessment.
That would be mine as well. So let me just, in the last, I think you characterized it, I don't know the exact date, but this transfer to the Commerce Control List, when did that start? When did that effort start?
2010 is when it really started. officially.
2010. Did you come to the Hill and testify in that regard?
No, I did not.
And at all, between 2010 and now, have you come and testified?
No, I have not.
Why do you suppose that when that action was being proposed under the previous administration, there didn't seem to be any aversion to it, but now there appears to be? Why do you suppose that is?
I think that's a really good question. My own perception is that it's a different landscape right now. It's highly political. I think that there's a lot of conflation between modernizing our export control laws and domestic gun control and gun control arguments.
And in the context, I mean, look, I hate to bring this up, but I think it's important to bring this up. You're familiar with the Fast and Furious
Yes, I am.
operation, et cetera.
Yes, I am.
Even in the context of the previous administration and that, let me ask you this, how did that arms transfer take place, if you know?
That was a lawful, as far as I know, it was a combination of lawful transfers and also unlawful exports by non-U.S. persons, purchasing weapons from licensed firearms dealers who were trying to get ATF involved and monitoring and preventing the transfers.
Was the State Department involved?
Not that I know of.
Was the Commerce Department
Well,
involved?
State Department was involved in terms of the lawful
Right.
exports that went down there.
Okay. But they still went, right?
Right, they did.
still went. And they're credited with killing not only people of a foreign country, but American citizens. Is that correct as well?
Correct.
It seems to me that the current process, if that's allowed to happen, is certainly lacking for a lot of reasons. And it also seems to me that even in the face of that, at that time, nobody apparently, well, certainly you weren't asked to come in, you're an expert in what you do, you're here now, but nobody at the time in Congress thought it important enough to bring you to testify and answer questions under that administration. But now that it's this administration, is the action significantly different under this administration than the previous one?
No, my understanding is that the proposed rules are largely unchanged from what was originally drafted. These categories were the first categories drafted.
Okay. And even under the Commerce Control List, national security foreign policy review of applications still takes place. Is that correct?
Yes,
Would they still be reviewed by the State Department for Human Rights, illicit trafficking, and other security concerns?
yes,
So it's essentially the same thing,
yes.
just streamlining it, but because we have a new administration, my words, not yours, that we disagree with, but was before okay is now not okay. Those are my, but you tend to agree with them.
Yes.
Do American small arms manufacturers sell abroad? I mean, is it a significant part of their business profile and their ability to stay in business and make a profit and produce not only items that are used by the military, but by American citizens to defend themselves, by law enforcement in America and around the world?
For some companies, it's very significant.
It is very significant. This technology's been around for a long time, I think.
For a long
right?
time. I think it might have originated with the Chinese.
About the 11th century, right? So the
Like that.
question is, and you've already heard the list which is incomplete, but you heard the list that my good friend from New York enumerated about the things that are already moved here of military concern. But is there any critical military advantage in the items listed in categories 1, 2, or 3 that are proposed to move to the CCL that would imperil the United States, or where we would be giving away a significant military advantage? Understanding one of the items that Mr. Zeldin talked about was nuclear weapons. Just one of them was nuclear weapons. That's already there.
From what I understand, this was looked at very, very closely and very extensively by experts within the government. And what they found is that the items listed to transition over to the Commerce Department do not give any significant improvements or exactly for United States security.
And I thank, ladies and gentlemen, and I've exceeded my time. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. If I could just, the purpose of this hearing isn't because it's the Trump administration proposing the rule change. I wasn't in Congress when the Obama administration was proposing this rule change. Otherwise, I would have hoped we would have had a similar hearing. It really is, how do we make sure when we're exporting these small arms, they don't end up in the hands of the wrong people? And again, I think we can all agree that we don't want, as Mr. Malinowski was pointing out, to see U.S.-made weapons on the front page of our hometown newspaper being used to kill civilians, and we ought to figure out the best way to prevent that from happening. With that, I'll recognize my colleague from California, Mr. Lee, for purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you. Thank you to witnesses for being here today. Let me just say for the record, I opposed the Obama administration's unauthorized war in Syria. I oppose the Trump administration's unauthorized war in Syria. I would have opposed this rule change had I been able to vote on it under Obama administration. I'm going to oppose it now under the Trump administration. This is not a partisan issue. This is about saving lives. So I have heard my colleagues' statements. I simply note that our troops who are stationed in Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq on the front lines, they are not being killed by nuclear weapons, by directed energy weapons, or by torpedoes. Many of them are getting shot. They're being killed by small arms weapons. And I have this article here that I want to enter into record. It's called Trump's New Gun Export Rules Could Aid Terrorists, Tyrants, and Criminals. And it's from CNN, dated February 14, 2019. If I could enter that into the record. Great.
Without objection.
All right, so let me ask some questions, either Mr. Abramson or Professor Welts. The U.S. has lost weapons that we gave to Syrian rebels and other folks that now end up in the hands of ISIS. Is that right?
That's correct.
And this is under the State Department, and we're going to have even less regulations and less oversight under the Commerce Department. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What we actually would want is more oversight, not less, if these weapons are ending up in our enemy's hands and then they're killing U.S. troops. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So, Ms. Reeves, I have a question for you. You had said that a bunch of these weapons could be brought in commercial retail places. Flamethrowers are one of the things here that would be transferred to their Commerce Department, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes,
Do
up
you know
to
if-
20 meters. Yeah.
Right, so do you know if Dick's Sporting Goods sells flamethrowers?
No, they don't.
That's right.
Not
So
that
there's
I know
actually
of.
items here that you couldn't actually go to a commercial retail establishment and buy, like flamethrowers, correct?
Okay.
Okay. Now, I'm going to reference this article we entered into the record from February. It says that, quote, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which are wagering a brutal war in Yemen that has killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and pushed the country to bring the famine, have, actually thousands of civilians, have aggregately requested by hundreds of millions of dollars of firearms from the U.S. Wouldn't you want Congress to know that that's the case, that countries are going to buy hundreds of millions of dollars of these kinds of weapons? Why would you want Congress to not know that?
Well, for military weapons, Congress will know about that. That is written into the law. And there is the potential for including congressional notifications. That's something that should be worked out between Congress and the Commerce Department.
So you wouldn't oppose that if there was this rule change, that Congress would still be notified of sales over $1 million?
I would have to see it.
Okay. Another part of this article is that the Philippines ordered $22 million worth of guns from the U.S. Professor Welch or Mr. Abramson, wouldn't Congress want to know about that?
Yes, of course it would. I mean, and they should have, actually. And then in the case that I referred to earlier, one of the big problems was that they didn't receive the notification by error.
So now that this proposal is to have a bunch of these weapons go under the Commerce Department's jurisdiction, I simply note that the head of the Commerce Department, Wilbur Ross, do any of you know if he has any military experience? He doesn't have any. He's a banker. And so we're going to have a banker make these kinds of decisions, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I've got another question for either Professor Welch or Mr. Abramson. What was your understanding of the original rationale under the Obama administration for proposing this?
My understanding was it was just part of the broader export control reform initiative, which had this process of changing how things were done and eventually ending up with one list that we never got to that point. But the arguments that this was never raised, no one raised an alarm during the Obama administration, disregards the fact that it was never introduced for us to raise an alarm. We certainly were ready and at that point would have raised this. We've been waiting for many years knowing this was coming, and so to say that somehow this is an Obama era thing and why didn't we raise an alarm really is a false reading of the history.
Thank you. And we just heard from our colleague, Congressman Malinowski, which basically said that he was opposed to it and he was in charge of one of the main offices at the time. Yes. I also want to just make two requests for the consideration of the chair. I do hope that either this subcommittee or their House Foreign Affairs Committee will mark up the legislation that Congresswoman Torres presented on today. I also want to offer for the chair's consideration my legislation called the Arms Sales Oversight Act. Right now in the U.S. Senate, any member of the Senate can introduce a privileged resolution which would cause a vote on arms sales transfers. We don't have the same thing in the House. This legislation would simply harmonize that and would request this committee to look at that else as well and decide whatever you want to do with it.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Liu.
And with that, thank you all for being here, and I yield back.
Great. Thank you. I'll recognize Congresswoman Omar for purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, and I hope you all will indulge me because I know that many of the people who are watching this testimony are like me. They're not really following most of the conversations and the kind of questions a lot of my colleagues are asking. It seems like a little inside baseball conversation. So I just want to simplify and sort of ask particular examples, and I hope you'll give me leniency with time as I try to get the public to sort of understand what we're really talking about. So I'll start with you, Mr. Abramson. There was a mass shooting in Munich in July of 2016 that left 10 people dead. and there was a clock, 17 semi-automatic weapon that was used. It's my understanding, is it your understanding that this administration's policy would make a weapon like that for gun manufacturers to export?
Yes, the semi-automatic weapons would move to the Commerce Control under this proposal.
Wonderful, thank you. And then, as you know, there were about 67 of the 77 people killed in the 2011 attacks in Norway were killed by gunfire. The shooter was armed by a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle and a Glock 37 semi-automatic handgun. Is it your understanding that this administration's policy would make a weapon like that for American manufacturers to export?
That is my understanding, yes.
Wonderful, thank you. And in 2015, on March 15th of this year, there was a shooting at a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, that left 50 people dead. The shooter was armed with 5 guns, 2 of which were semi-automatic rifles. Is it your understanding that this policy would make it easier for American manufacturers to export that weapon?
Indeed, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Okay. So according to Inside Crime, 85% of the pistols that are used by MS-13 in Guatemala were stolen from Guatemalan law enforcement agencies. Is it your understanding that this administration would make it easier for American manufacturers to sell weapons to Guatemalan police?
Yes, there's going to be a process either way, but yes,
Wonderful.
that's the case.
Thank you. And so, Ms. Reeves, I also have few questions following up to that. In your testimony, you talked about the need for American gun manufacturers to have easier time selling weapons to NATO and non-NATO allies. Norway and Germany are our allies. So I can have this be clear for our constituents who are watching. Is it your position that the United States should make it easier to export the kind of weapons that were used in the mass shootings that I just mentioned in Norway and Germany?
I don't agree with the word easier, because in fact, if these items do move over to Commerce Department, I don't think it's going to be easier. It's going to be different. We're talking about right-sizing the export control policy, and so it's a difference of who's going to be issuing the licenses.
In
Because
your
I don't think what
testimony,
we're talking
you
ab-
did say we have to ease the process. We have to make it a little easier for these weapons to move. So in
It's
that,
right-
would it make it easier for us to sell? It's just very simple. Would it make easier for us to sell these weapons in Norway and Germany?
The licensing process would still be in place, and it would be a very extensive review on the front end for national security and human rights issues and foreign policy issues. So all of those reviews would still be in place by Commerce, State Department, and DOD.
All right, wonderful. And Ms. Reeves, in light of what happened last week, I find it a little disturbing that we are having this conversation after 11 days of the shooting in New Zealand, talking to people who manufacture guns, arguing for the need to loosen restrictions to import assault rifles. But as you mentioned, the domestic laws of trading with our partners still does not violate the administration's policy. That means that American gun manufacturers will not be able to export semi-automatic rifles and assault rifles to places like New Zealand, even under these regulations, correct?
Well, again, we're not talking about loosening controls over exports of firearms. We're talking about a different agency that would be in charge of issuing licenses. And again, those reviews would still be in place, and there would be reviews after the fact with end-use monitoring and end-use checks by Commerce Department.
In New Zealand, would we still be able to sell these semi-automatic weapons?
I'm not going to speak for the government in what they will or will not approve, but my understanding is that there's a long history of the State Department issuing export licenses for New Zealand.
The reason you're not speaking on it, is it correct, is that in New Zealand, they had just passed a law that prohibits these kind of weapons to be used.
I
And
think the
so-
law was passed after.
Yes, after the shooting has
Right,
taken
and
place,
so,
yes.
so the
No, that
US,
was
the
just
US government
the
would not
gist of it.
issue a license, though, if it would violate local law.
Precisely, that is what I was trying to get at. Thank you so much. And then I'll just finish up with asking Dr. Walls. I believe that insisting on human rights standards around the world is not just a moral responsibility, but a national security imperative. You mentioned in your testimony that 60% of the grave human rights abuses investigated by Amnesty International involved firearms. The country that I come from, Somalia, really is an example of what my colleague from New York was talking about. He mentioned Congo and other places, but Somalia is a really good example of what happens when we just allow firearms to run rampant. Is it correct that the administration's policy would make it easier for gun manufacturers to sell to governments with patterns of human rights violations?
I think it would, yes. And if I might add, I think the big error in this consideration of this category of weapons is not to consider their lethality. It's to treat them as though they are simple commercial products that are easily available instead of the dangerous items that they are.
Yeah, and lastly, I just wanted to, I had the opportunity to visit Honduras when the elections were happening in 2017. And so I know that we have a lot of interactions with Honduras, and so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the post-electoral violence in Honduras, where dozens of people were killed by state security forces and the military police and other Honduras security forces. They used semi-automatic weapons to kill a lot of these protesters. The post-electoral crisis was one of the main drivers of the current refugee crisis that we're seeing from Central America. And so I just wanted to have on the record, is it correct that the administration's policy would make it easier for gun manufacturers to sell weapons to Honduras security forces?
Could very well have that effect.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you. And I'll recognize my colleague from New York, Mr. Esplat, for purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 1134 for multiple reasons. First and foremost, I believe it is important that this function remains within the State Department. Simply, it just sends the wrong message that moving arms export from the Department of State to the Department of Commerce, it sort of like creates the real impression that this is a commercial transaction, right? That no human factor is involved, that it is going to be so clean and septic that no one is ever going to die. It's like, we're trading coffee or sugar or something, but in this case, obviously, it's arms. Secondly, I believe that it is vital that Congress continues to conduct strong oversight over these transactions, as we must be able to ensure that American interests and priorities are upheld. And obviously, this doesn't strengthen oversight. I believe that it weakens it. And finally, I believe that it is vital because of the threat of gun violence at home and abroad that we must do all we can do to ensure that guns do not fall into the wrong hands. I want to address this from a sort of like different angle, right? Because although semi-automatic weapons are horrible and they show their ugly face every so often, and the consequences are so tragic, as we just saw in New Zealand, it is handguns really that are taking the vast number of lives here in the United States and in urban cities across the world. And as sectors, very radical sectors of urban settings, begin to radicalize themselves and begin to act in very aggressive and violent ways, I think it is incumbent upon us to make it even more difficult for the wrong people to get their hands on handguns. Now, I sponsor a piece of legislation that that is called the Ghost Guns Are Guns Act, because ghost guns are a way to circumvent local measures to restrict access to guns, as well as 3D printed guns. How do you see this whole debate with regards to access to handguns? Is it going to make it more easier to access handguns, ghost guns, 3D printed guns, etc., across the world? And we're going to be the great exporter of death now, not just through semi-automatic weapons, but also through handguns. Anybody that would like to tackle this?
I'm glad you've asked this question, because this is clearly one of the areas where our export policy has a big play on this, because currently ghost guns or 3D printed guns are regulated as an export. You put them online and anybody can get them. That is what this proposal would change, and it is completely alarming. It's completely alarming for domestic reasons and for international reasons that you're talking about, which is where, we're not having a domestic gun control debate when we're talking about the export, but in this case we are, and it's very important. So Dr. Waltz has been looking at this a bit more than I do. If you want to
Dr.
add.
Waltz?
Well, just simply in terms of a little bit of the regulations that are involved, the Commerce Department has, as part of its rules, that if any technology is available, open source, and readily available for anyone, that they do not make any effort to regulate it. And that they've asserted that if these weapons would migrate over to their control, they simply will not have any control at all. We've seen slightly different approaches in the previous State Department and this State Department, but I think we're at a place where right now the possibilities of control for export remain in place as long as they are on the State Department side of the divide. If they move over to Commerce, it's crystal clear that there's no control.
Finally, Mr. Abraham, there is a pending court case that prevents the online publication of 3D printed guns. How did this lawsuit come about, and with the transfers of these items, how will this lawsuit be impacted?
I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is functionally, if this transaction were to happen, these moved over to the State Department, there would be no longer any control. It moved over to Commerce, there would no longer be any control in the State Department, so I don't understand why the lawsuit would continue. Other lawyers might know better, but functionally, you would abdicate the suit, because there would be no purpose for it, because it's no longer a State Department controlled weapon.
Any lawyers in the House? No. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I'll recognize my colleague from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and Ranking Member Zeldin for holding today's hearing on the importance of export controls to properly regulate the sale of defense articles and firearms. And I thank our witnesses for being here today and for their testimony. Our nation's export control regime is a critical tool for ensuring that the weapons, materials, and technologies that we produce for military and commercial purposes, particularly those that can inflict deadly harm, do not end up in the wrong hands. Recent proposals from the Trump administration in the last year to remove several types of military model firearms from the U.S. munitions list under the jurisdiction of the State Department and move them to the commercial control list could jeopardize our ability, in my view, to determine the manner in which these weapons may be used, and could ultimately lead to these weapons ending up in the hands of those who would threaten our nation's security interests. And I thank the witnesses for their testimony and the regarding the impact that these policy proposals could have on foreign policy, and the suggestions that you've made in your testimony, and ways that we can strengthen our export control system. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Abramson. In your testimony, you mentioned that the State Department requires the suspension of sales to countries that violate human rights. Could you talk a little bit about some kind of historical examples of that and what the implications of this new proposal might be on those efforts?
Certainly, and I think maybe the most relevant right now is what we're seeing with the arming of the Saudis and the Emiratis as they conduct their war in Yemen. There have been concerns about their misuse of U.S. supplied weapons. It's very rare, actually, to hear publicly that the administration has found a violation of human rights, but that does seem to be what's happening, and that's what's driven a lot of concern about how that misuse of weaponry could occur. It's very important that these regulations within the current system also provide a chance for the Congress to be notified if violations occur and then actions to occur. My understanding is if this moved to Commerce, that would not be the case any longer.
Thank you. And Professor Walls, would you speak a little bit about the relationship that you have observed between countries that have security forces that and may not have kind of strong internal controls, and that relationship to organized criminal activity in those countries, and the danger of weapons falling into the hands of, organized crime or criminals, and the significance of that, and particularly in countries with weak internal controls, and how these policies might impact those dangers?
So really, you're talking about issues of diversion, and you may have one authorized recipient, and then because of lax controls, as we've seen in Mexico, where all of the weapons that are lawfully commercially supplied to Mexico go into the federal police or the military, and then they transfer them, and then in the hands of local police, they are used to violate human rights, sometimes the most awful sorts of extrajudicial executions and enforced disappearances. We're seeing something very similar with the Philippines. So it's not at all uncommon for the controls locally to be lax. And so if you are thinking particularly about issuing a license for a country as a whole and not scrutinizing which units might actually receive those weapons, you're multiplying the possibilities of abuse.
Thank you. And I thank the chairman and the ranking member again. As we all know, we have a very pernicious gun violence problem in this country. We ought not to put forward policies that will in any way export that very pernicious problem we have in America to other countries around the world and bring less stability and more unrest to places all over the world. So I thank you for convening this hearing on this very important subject, and I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses and all the members for being here today. And with that, the committee is adjourned.
Chairman Barra, may I ask for just 1 second?
Yeah, well,
I know this is...
with some latitude, I'll go ahead and give you a second. I will then extend the same courtesy to Ms. Reeves and Ms. Abramson if they...
I realize this is highly exceptional, but I want to say that over the weekend, I spent a lot of time combing through the Commerce Control List, looking for items that had been transferred, the 600 items, the 600 series items, and what I found were not military lethal weapons. What I found were unarmed, unarmored vehicles, non-submersible, unarmed submarine rescue ships, shelters that were specifically to provide against nuclear or biological contamination, radar equipment, telecommunications, joysticks, circuit boards, rheostats, etc. I did not find any weapons, any items that were recognizable as lethal weapons. The one item I'm aware of that has caused concern in the human rights community is equipment to spray tear gas. But I would really appreciate that being entered into the record. Thank you very much.
It will be. And Ms. Reeves, I'll extend you.
What I will say to that is one of the, some of the items that have moved from the U.S. munitions list is riot control agents. And those have moved over to the Commerce Control List. I will also just reiterate that, again, State Department will have absolute visibility in the review process of license applications. If there's any objection or reservation from the State Department on issuing a license, that will not be overruled, my understanding is, by Commerce Department. So those review processes for human rights and unrest in certain regions will be reviewed and adhered to.
Great. And with that, this committee is adjourned.